I didn't leave my life. That's what makes this harder to explain. I didn't pack a bag, I didn't vanish, I didn't burn anything down. I stayed where I was. I kept showing up. I answered messages. I paid bills. I smiled at the right moments. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. But somewhere along the way, I stepped out of myself and never fully returned. It happened gradually, which is why no one noticed, not even me at first. I used to think disappearing required distance. New cities. New names. New beginnings. Now I know that you can disappear while standing perfectly still. All it takes is enough compromise, enough silence, enough days where you choose what's expected instead of what's true. I remember when it started feeling wrong, even though everything looked right. I would finish a day and feel strangely absent from it, as if I had watched myself live instead of actually being there. Conversations passed through me without leaving a mark. Decisions felt automatic, like muscle memory from a life I no longer questioned. People described me as calm, grounded, reliable. I accepted those words because they sounded like praise. What they really meant was predictable, safe, easy to place. I had learned how to exist without taking up emotional space. At first, I told myself this was maturity. You grow up, you settle, you stop chasing feelings. You become reasonable. I repeated that story often enough that it almost convinced me. Almost. The cracks appeared in quiet moments. Late at night. Long drives with no destination. Mornings when I woke up already tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the effort of being someone I no longer felt connected to. There was a constant low hum inside me, not sadness, not anger, just a dull pressure. Like holding your breath without realizing it. I functioned well, but nothing touched me deeply anymore. Joy felt muted. Pain felt distant. Everything existed at a safe emotional temperature. I didn't realize numbness could be addictive. It protects you. It smooths edges. It keeps you from falling apart. But it also keeps you from feeling real. And the longer I lived that way, the harder it became to remember who I had been before. I stopped asking myself difficult questions. Not consciously. I just avoided silence long enough that they couldn't surface. I filled my days with structure, routines, responsibilities. Things that justified my exhaustion and left no room for reflection. When people asked how I was, I answered honestly, or so I thought. Fine. Busy. All good. Those words weren't lies. They were incomplete truths, carefully edited to avoid opening doors I wasn't ready to walk through. The scariest realization came one evening when I tried to imagine my future and felt nothing. Not fear. Not excitement. Just blank continuation. Same rhythms. Same roles. Same version of me, slowly aging without ever fully arriving. That should have terrified me. Instead, it felt normal. That's when I understood how deep I had gone. I hadn't lost my life in one dramatic failure. I had traded it away slowly, one reasonable choice at a time. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they built a life that functioned perfectly without me at its center. I began to notice how often I chose silence to avoid discomfort. How often I agreed because disagreement felt exhausting. How often I minimized my own reactions because they seemed inconvenient. I wasn't suppressing myself out of fear, I was doing it out of habit. And habits are harder to break than rules. There were moments when something inside me tried to resurface. A sudden wave of emotion while listening to music. An unexpected tightness in my chest while watching someone lie freely, loudly, imperfectly. Those moments passed quickly, but they left residue, a reminder that something in me was still alive, still watching. I started to feel like a guest in my own existence. Polite. Detached. Temporarily present. As if my real life were happening somewhere else, and I was just waiting for it to begin. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing was coming to rescue me from this. No collapse. No crisis. No external permission to change. If I wanted to return to my own life, I would have to admit that I had already left it quietly, carefully, without telling anyone. And that realization was more destabilizing than any breakdown could have been. Because how do you explain to the world or to yourself that you are grieving a life that technically never ended? The dark secret wasn't something I had done. It was something I had decided not to do and then buried so deep that even I forgot it was a choice. I had convinced myself that this was just who I was now. Quieter. More contained. Less demanding. I wore that identity like a carefully pressed suit. It fit well enough that no one questioned it. Eventually, neither did I. But secrets don't stay quiet forever. They don't announce themselves. They leak. Mine leaked through small, irrational reactions. A sudden irritation at harmless questions. A sharp envy toward people who seemed unafraid to want things openly. A disproportionate sadness when something minor ended, like it was echoing a much larger loss I refused to name. I remember the moment the secret finally surfaced. I was alone, doing something ordinary, when a thought crossed my mind so clearly it stopped me cold. I chose this life because it allowed me to disappear without being blamed. That was the truth I hadn't wanted to face. I hadn't been forced into this existence. I had selected it precisely because it required less courage. Because it rewarded self-erasure with approval. Because it let me avoid risk while still appearing responsible. Disappearing quietly was safer than failing loudly. Once I admitted that, the numbness began to crack. I saw how often I had said no to myself before the world even had a chance to respond, how many desires I had preemptively dismissed to avoid the humiliation of wanting something that might not work out. How carefully I had lowered my expectations until disappointment became impossible and meaning along with it. The realization was humiliating. Not tragic. Humiliating. I had always believed that fear looked dramatic. Panic. Doubt. Anxiety. But my fear had been methodical. Polite. Rational. It had built a life around itself and called it maturity. There were nights after that when sleep wouldn't come. Not because I was anxious, but because I was suddenly present. Thoughts I had suppressed for years lined up, demanding attention. Not accusing me, just asking to be acknowledged. What did you want before you learned to be acceptable? When did you decide that safety mattered more than truth? Who would you be if you stopped trying to disappear? Those questions felt dangerous. Answering them would require movement. And movement would disrupt the fragile equilibrium I had built. So I tried to bargain. I told myself I could change internally without changing externally. That I could reconnect with myself quietly, privately, without upsetting anyone or anything. I read. I reflected. I made small promises to myself that required no visible action. It didn't work. Self-awareness without expression only deepened the tension. I could see myself disappearing in real time now, which made staying unbearable in a new way. I wasn't numb anymore. I was restrained. I began to feel trapped by my own competence. By how well I had learned to function in a life that no longer fit. From the outside, it would have seemed absurd to disrupt something so stable. From the inside, it felt like suffocation disguised as success. The moral dilemma sharpened. Was I allowed to leave a life that wasn't abusive, chaotic, or broken, just empty? Was I allowed to disappoint people simply because I had disappointed myself for too long? Did wanting more make me ungrateful, or honest? I didn't know the answers. I only knew that staying had started to feel like an act of quiet violence against myself. The more I acknowledged that, the harder it became to perform. Smiles took effort. Agreement felt heavy. I began to hesitate in conversations, catching myself before saying things I didn't mean. That hesitation was noticed. People asked if I was okay. I said yes. Not because it was true, but because I didn't yet know how to explain a pain that came from absence rather than loss. The darkest part wasn't the regret. It was the fear that I had waited too long, that the version of me capable of choosing differently had already atrophied beyond recovery. That even if I left now, I wouldn't know how to arrive anywhere else. That fear kept me frozen longer than I want to admit. But something else grew alongside it: anger. Not explosive, not loud focused. Directed inward at first, then outward toward the structures I had mistaken for necessity. That anger didn't want destruction, it wanted truth. And truth has momentum. I started to understand that the secret wasn't that I had disappeared. The secret was that part of me was still watching, and it was running out of patience. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't have a plan. I only knew that continuing exactly as I was had become impossible. The disappearance had kept me safe. Now it was asking to be undone. Undoing a disappearance doesn't look like returning. It looks like resistance. Not the dramatic kind. Not a sudden declaration or a clean break. It looks like friction, small, constant friction against a life that has grown comfortable with your absence. The first thing I had to accept was that I wouldn't feel ready. Readiness was a myth I had used for years to justify waiting. If I waited to feel confident, certain, prepared, I would never move. The numb version of me thrived on preparation because preparation never required action. So I acted without clarity. I started speaking when silence felt easier. Not eloquently. Not bravely. Just honestly enough to disrupt the pattern. I said I don't know when I had previously said it doesn't matter. I admitted uncertainty instead of masking it with agreement. Those moments were uncomfortable, visibly uncomfortable. But discomfort was proof that I was present again. I began letting myself feel the consequences of honesty. Confusion. Disappointment. Awkward pauses where people recalibrated their expectations of me. I had spent so long making myself predictable that unpredictability felt like betrayal. But it was also relief. There were days I wanted to retreat. Days when the old numbness tempted me like a warm, quiet room. Disappearing had been efficient. Reappearing was messy. It required tolerating misunderstanding from others and from myself. What I didn't expect was grief. Grief for the years I had lived half awake. Grief for the versions of myself that never had a chance to exist. Grief for the relationships shaped around someone who wasn't fully there. That grief came in waves, often triggered by ordinary things, a familiar place, an old habit, a phrase I used to repeat automatically. I let it come. That was new. Before, I would have analyzed it, minimized it, explained it away. Now I stayed with it long enough to understand what it was saying. Grief wasn't asking me to go back. It was asking me not to disappear again. The world didn't change dramatically. That surprised me. I had expected consequences to be louder, more punishing. Instead, most things continued. Some relationships shifted. Some distances became clear. Some people adjusted. Some didn't. Life absorbed my return with less resistance than I had imagined. The real resistance came from inside. I had to relearn how to want things without immediately negotiating them down. How to feel dissatisfaction without treating it as a flaw. How to choose without needing external validation. Those skills had weakened from lack of use. They came back slowly, awkwardly, like muscles after a long illness. I failed often. I hesitated. I slipped back into old habits. But now I noticed when it happened. Awareness changed the quality of failure. It became information, not identity. The most important shift wasn't in what I did, it was in how I measured my life. I stopped asking whether things were acceptable and started asking whether they were honest. That single change exposed many compromises I had been calling stability. I didn't suddenly become fearless. Fear still accompanied every meaningful choice. The difference was that I stopped treating fear as a stop sign. I learned to see it as a signal that something mattered. Over time, the numbness loosened its grip. Feelings returned unevenly. Some days were heavy. Some days were sharp. Some were unexpectedly light. I welcomed all of it. Feeling everything imperfectly was still better than feeling nothing efficiently. I understood then that disappearing had never been about escape. It had been about control. Control over disappointment. Over vulnerability. Over the possibility of wanting something and not getting it. Letting go of that control was terrifying and necessary. If you're listening to this because you recognize the quiet version of disappearance, the kind that happens without leaving a trace, hear this: you don't need a crisis to justify returning to yourself. You don't need permission. You don't need a perfect plan. You need honesty that is inconvenient enough to change something. I didn't reclaim my life in one moment. I reclaimed it in hundreds of small refusals to stay silent, to stay numb, to stay absent just because it was easier. I am not finished. I don't have a clean ending to offer. What I have is presence, fragile, imperfect, demanding, real. I am here now. Not performing. Not disappearing. Not waiting. And that, I've learned, is what it actually means to come back to your own life.